Part 11 of Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, 1871, 1888. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, 1871, 1888, by Frances Roe. Section 11, Letters from 1879 and 1880. Fort Ellis, Montana Territory, January, 1879. It is still cold, stinging cold, and we are beginning to think that there was much truth in what we were told on our way over last fall, that Fort Ellis is the very coldest place in the whole territory. For 2 days the temperature was 50 below, and I can assure you that things hummed. The logs of our house made loud reports like pistol shots, and there was frost on the walls of every room that was not near roaring fires. No one ventures forth such weather unless compelled to do so, and then, of course, every precaution is taken to guard against freezing. In this altitude one will freeze before feeling the cold, as I know from experience, having at the present time 2 fiery red ears of enormous size. They are fiery in feeling, too, as well as in color. The atmosphere looks like frozen mist, and is wonderful, and almost at any time between sunrise and sunset a sundog can be seen with its scintillating rainbow tints that are brilliant yet exquisitely delicate in coloring. Our houses are really very warm. The thick logs are plastered inside and papered. Every window has a storm sash, and every room a double floor, and our big stoves can burn immense logs. But notwithstanding all this, our greatest trial is to keep things to eat. Everything freezes solid, and so far we have not found one edible that is improved by freezing. It must be awfully discouraging to a cook to find on a biting cold morning that there is not one thing in the house that can be prepared for breakfast until it has passed through the thawing process, that even the water in the barrels has become solid, round pieces of ice. All along the roof of one side of our house are immense icicles that almost touch the snow on the ground. These are a reminder of the last Chinook. But only last week it was quite pleasant. Not real summery, but warm enough for one to go about in safety. Faye came down from the sawmill one of those days to see the commanding officer about something, and to get the mail. When he was about to start back, in fact was telling me good-bye, I happened to say that I wished I could go too. Faye said, "You could not stand the exposure, but you might wear my little fur coat." Suggesting the coat was a give-in that I at once took advantage of, and in precisely 20 minutes Charlie, our Chinese cook, had been told what to do. A few articles of clothing wrapped and strapped, and I on Betty's back ready for the wilds. An old soldier on a big corral horse was our only escort, and to his saddle were fastened our various bags and bundles. Far up in a narrow valley that lies in between 2 mountain ranges, the government has a sawmill that is worked by 20 or more soldiers under the supervision of an officer, where lumber can be cut when needed for the post. One of these ranges is very high, and Mount Bridger, first of the range and nearest Fort Ellis, along whose base we had to go, has snow on its top most of the year. Often when wind is not noticeable at the post, we can see the light snow being blown with terrific force from the peak of this mountain for hundreds of yards, in a perfectly horizontal line, where it will spread out and fall in a magnificent spray another 200 or 300 feet. The mill is 16 miles from Fort Ellis, and the snow was very deep, so deep in places that the horses had difficulty in getting their feet forward, and as we got further up, the valley narrowed into a ravine where the snow was even deeper. There was no road or even trail to be seen. The bark on trees had been cut to mark the way, but far astray we could not have gone unless we had deliberately ridden up the side of a mountain. The only thing that resembled a house along the 16 miles was a deserted cabin about halfway up, and which only accentuated the awful loneliness. Betty had been standing in the stable for several days, and that, with the biting cold air in the valley, made her entirely too frisky, and she was very nervous, too, over the deep snow that held her feet down. We went Indian file, I always in the middle, as there were little grades and falling off places all along that were hidden by the snow, and I was cautioned constantly by Faye and Bryant to keep my horse in line. The snow is very fine and dry in this altitude, and never packs as it does in more moist atmosphere. When we had ridden about one half the distance up, we came to a little hill, at the bottom of which was known to be a bridge that crossed the deep-cut banks of one of those mountain streams that are dry 11 months of the year and raging torrents the 12th, when the snow melts. It so happened that Faye did not get on this bridge just right, so down in the light snow he and Pete went, and all that we could see of them were Faye's head and shoulders, and the head of the horse, with the awful bulging eyes. Poor Pete was terribly frightened, and floundered about until he nearly buried himself in snow as he tried to find something solid upon which to put his feet. I was just back of Faye when he went down, but the next instant I had retreated to the top of the hill, and had to use all the strength in my arms to avoid being brought back to the post. When Betty saw Pete go down, she whirled like a flash, and with 2 or 3 bounds was on top of the hill again. She was awfully frightened, and stood close to Bryant's horse, trembling all over. Poor Bryant did not know what to do or which one to assist, so I told him to go down and get the lieutenant up on the bank, and I would follow. Just how Faye got out of his difficulty I did not see, for I was too busy attending to my own affairs. Betty acted as though she was bewitched, and go down to the bridge she would not. Finally, when I was about tired out, Faye said we must not waste more time there, and that I had better ride Pete. So I dismounted, and the saddles were changed, and then there was more trouble. Pete had never been ridden by a woman before, and thinking perhaps that his sudden one-sidedness was part of the bridge performance, he at once protested by jumps and lunges, but he soon quieted down, and we started on again. Betty danced a little with Faye, but that was all. She evidently remembered her lost battle with him at Camp Baker. It was almost dark when we reached the sawmill, and as soon as it became known that I was with the lieutenant, every man sprang up from some place underneath the snow to look at me, and 2 or 3 ran over to assist Bryant with our things. It was awfully nice to know that I was a person of importance, even if it was out in a camp in the mountains where probably a woman had never been before. The little log cabin built for officers had only the one long room, with large comfortable bunk, 2 tables, chairs, a settle of pine boards, and near one end of the room was a box stove large enough to heat 2 rooms of that size. By the time my stiffened body could get inside, the stove had been filled to the top with pine wood that roared and crackled in a most cheerful and inviting manner. But the snow out there! I do not consider it advisable to tell the exact truth, so I will simply say that it was higher than the cabin, but that for some reason it had left an open space of about 3 feet all around the logs, and that gave us air and light through windows which had been thoughtfully placed unusually high. The long stable, built against a bank, where the horses and mules were kept, was entirely buried underneath the snow, and you would never have dreamed that there was anything whatever there unless you had seen the path that had been shoveled down to the door. The cabin the men lived in I did not see at all. We were in a ravine where the pine forest was magnificent, but one could see that the trees were shortened many feet by the great depth of snow. Our meals were brought to us by Bryant from the soldiers' mess, and as the cook was only a pickup, they were often a mess indeed, but every effort was made to have them nice. The day after we got there the cook evidently made up his mind that some recognition should be shown of the honor of my presence in the woods, so he made a big fat pie for my dinner. It was really fat, for the crust must have been mostly of lard, and the poor man had taken much pains with the decorations of twisted rings and little balls that were on the top. It really looked very nice as Bryant set it down on the table in front of me, with an air that the most dignified of butlers might have envied, and said, "Compliments of the cook, ma'am." Of course I was and am still delighted with the attention from the cook, but for some reason I was suspicious of that pie. It was so very high up, so I continued to talk about it admiringly until after Bryant had gone from the cabin, and then I tried to cut it. The filling, and there was an abundance, was composed entirely of big, hard raisins that still had their seeds in. The knife could not cut them, so they rolled over on the table and on the floor, much like marbles. I scooped out a good-sized piece as well as I could, gathered up the runaway raisins, and then put it in the stove. And this I did at every dinner while I was there, almost trembling each time for fear Bryant would come in and discover how the pie was being disposed of. It lasted long, for I could not cut off a piece for Fay, as Bryant had given us to understand in the beginning that the chef d'oeuvre was for me alone. Nothing pleases me more than to have the enlisted men pay me some little attention, and when, the day after the pie, a beautiful little gray squirrel was brought to me in a nice airy box, I was quite overcome. He is very much like Billy in size and color, which seems remarkable, since Billy was from the far south, and this little fellow from the far north. I wanted to take him out of the box at once, but the soldier said he would bite, and having great respect for the teeth of a squirrel, I let him stay in his prison while we were out there. The first time I let him out after we got home he was frantic, and jumped up on the mantel, tables, and chairs, scattering things right and left. Finally he started to run up a lace window curtain back of the sewing machine. On top of the machine was a plate of warm cookies that Charlie had just brought to me, and getting a sniff of those, the squirrel stopped instantly, hesitated just a second, and then over he jumped, took a cookie with his paws, and afterwards held it with his teeth until he had settled himself comfortably, when he again took it in his paws and proceeded to eat it with the greatest relish. After he had eaten all he very well could, he hid the rest back of the curtain in quite an at-home way. There was nothing at all wonderful in all this, except that the squirrel was just from the piney woods, where warm sugar cookies are unknown, so how did he know they were good to eat? I was at the sawmill 4 days, and then we all came in together on bobsleds. There were 4 mules for each sleigh, so not much attention was paid to the great depth of snow. Both horses knew when we got to the bridge and gave Bryant trouble. Every bit of the trail out had been obliterated by drifting snow, and I still wonder how these animals recognized the precise spot when the snow was level in every place. We found the house in excellent order, and consider our new Chinaman a treasure. A few days before Fay went to the mill, I made some Boston brown bread. I always make that myself, as I fancy I can make it very good, but for some reason I was late in getting it on to steam that day, so when I went to the kitchen to put it in the oven, I found a much abused Chinaman. When he saw what I was about to do he became very angry, and his eyes looked green. He said, "You no put him in oven." I said, "Yes, Charlie, I have to, for 1 hour." He said, "You no care workman, you spoil my dinny, you get some other boy." Now Charlie was an excellent servant, and I did not care to lose him, but to take that bread out was not to be considered. I would no longer have been mistress of my own house. So I told him quietly, "Very well," and closed the oven door with great deliberation. The dinner was a little better than usual, and I wondered all the time what the outcome would be. I knew that he was simply piqued because I had not let him make the bread. After his work was all done, he came in and said, with a smile that was almost a grin, "I go now. I send 'nother boy." And go he did. But the "other boy" came in time to give us a delicious breakfast, and everything went on just the same as when old Charlie was here. He is in Bozeman and comes to see us often. This Charlie takes good care of my chickens, that are my pride and delight. There are 20, and every one is snow white. Some have heavy, round topknots. I found them at different ranches. It is so cold here that the chicken roosts have to be covered with strips of blanket, and made flat and broad, so the feathers will cover the chickens' feet. Otherwise they will be frozen. It is a treat to have fresh eggs, and without having to pay $1.50 per dozen for them. That is the price we have paid for eggs almost ever since we came to the Territory. End of letter. Fort Ellis, Montana Territory, June, 1880. Everything is packed and on the wagons. That is, all but the camp outfit, which we will use on the trip over, and in the morning we will start on our way back to Fort Shaw. With the furniture that belongs to the quarters, and the camp things, we were so comfortable in our own house we decided that there was no necessity to go to Mrs. Adams, except for dinner and breakfast, although both General and Mrs. Adams have been most hospitable and kind. The way these two moves have come about seems very funny to me. Faye was ordered over here to command C Company when it was left without an officer, because he was senior second lieutenant in the regiment and entitled to it. The captain of this company has been East on recruiting service, and has just been relieved by Colonel Knight, captain of Faye's company at Shaw. As that company is now without an officer, the senior second lieutenant has to return and command his own company. This recognition of a little rank has been expensive to us, and disagreeable too. The lieutenants are constantly being moved about, often details that apparently do not amount to much, but which take much of their small salary. The Chinaman is going with us, for which I am most thankful, and at his request we have decided to take the white chickens. Open boxes have been made specially for them that fit on the rear ends of the wagons, and we think they will be very comfortable, but we will certainly look like emigrants when on the road. The 2 squirrels will go also. The men of the company have sent me 3 squirrels during the winter. The dearest one of all had been injured and lived only a few days. The flying squirrel is the least interesting and seems stupid. It will lie around and sleep during the entire day, but at dark will manage to get on some high perch and flop down on your shoulder or head when you least expect it and least desire it too. The little uncanny thing cannot fly really, but the webs enable it to make tremendous leaps. I expect that it looks absurd for us to be taking across the country a small menagerie, but the squirrels were presents and of course had to go, and the chickens are beautiful and give us quantities of eggs. Besides, if we had left the chickens, Charlie might not have gone, for he feeds them and watches over them as if they were his very own, and looks very cross if the striker gives them even a little corn. Night before last an unusually pleasant dancing party was given by Captain McAndrews, when Faye and I were guests of honor. It was such a surprise to us, and so kind in Captain McAndrews to give it, for he is a bachelor. Supper was served in his own quarters, but dancing was in the vacant set adjoining. The rooms were beautifully decorated with flags, and the fragrant cedar and spruce. Mrs. Adams, wife of the commanding officer, superintended all of the arrangements, and also assisted in receiving. The supper was simply delicious, as all army suppers are, and I fancy that she and other ladies of the garrison were responsible for the perfect salads and cakes. The orchestra was from Bozeman, so the music was very good. Quite a party of young people also, many of them friends of ours, came up from Bozeman, which not only swelled the number of guests, but gave life to the dance, for in a small garrison like this the number of partners is limited. The country about here is beautiful now. The snow is melting on the mountains, and there is such a lovely green every place. I almost wish we might have remained until fall, for along the valleys and through the canyons there are grand trails for horseback riding, while Fort Shaw has nothing of the kind. End of letter. Fort Shaw, Montana Territory, July, 1880. We are with the commanding officer and his wife for a few days while our house is being settled. Every room has just been painted and tinted, and looks so clean and bright. The Chinamen, squirrels, and chickens are there now, and are already very much at home, and Charlie is delighted that the chickens are so much admired. The first part of the trip over was simply awful. The morning was beautiful when we left Ellis, warm and sunny, and everybody came to see us off. We started in fine spirits, and all went well for 10 or 12 miles, when we got to the headwaters of the Missouri, where the three small rivers, Gallatin, Jefferson, and Madison, join and make the one big river. The drive through the forest right there is usually delightful, and although we knew that the water was high in the Gallatin by Fort Ellis, we were wholly unprepared for the scene that confronted us when we reached the valley. Not 1 inch of ground could be seen, nothing but the trees surrounded by yellow, muddy water that showed quite a current. The regular stage road has been made higher than the ground because of these July freshets, when the snow is melting on the mountains, but it was impossible to keep on it, as its many turns could not be seen, and it would not have helped much either, as the water was deep. The ambulance was in the lead, of course, so we were in all the excitement of exploring unseen ground. The driver would urge the mules, and if the leaders did not go down, very good, we would go on, perhaps a few yards. If they did go down enough to show that it was dangerous that way, he would turn them in another direction and try there. Sometimes it was necessary almost to turn around in order to keep upon the higher ground. In this way mules and drivers worked until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the dirty water often coming up over the floor of the ambulance, and many times it looked as if we could not go on 1 step further without being upset in the mud and water. But at 4 we reached an island where there was a small house and a stable for the stage relay horses, and not far beyond was another island where Faye decided to camp for the night. It was the only thing he could have done. He insisted upon my staying at the house, but I finally convinced him that the proper place for me was in camp, and I went on with him. The island was very small, and the highest point above water could not have been over 2 feet. Of course everything had to be put upon it: horses, mules, wagons, drivers, Faye and I, and the 2 small squirrels, and the chickens also. In addition to our own traveling menagerie, there were native inhabitants of that island, millions and millions of mosquitoes, each one with a sharp appetite and sharp sting. We thought that we had learned all about vicious mosquitoes while in the South, but the Southern mosquitoes are slow and caressing in comparison to those Montana things. It was very warm, and the Chinaman felt sorry for the chickens shut up in the boxes, where fierce quarrels seemed to be going on all the time. So after he had fed them we talked it over, and decided to let them out, as they could not possibly get away from us across the big body of water. There were 20 large chickens in one big box, and 27 small ones that had been brought in a long box by themselves. Well, Charlie and one of the men got the boxes down and opened them. At once the 4 or 5 mother hens clucked and scratched, and kept on clucking until the little chicks were let out, when every one of them ran to its own mother, and each hen strutted off with her own brood. That is the absolute truth, but is not all. When night came the chickens went back to their boxes to roost, all but the small ones. Those were left outside with their mothers, and just before daylight Charlie raised a great commotion when he put them up for the day's trip. When we were about ready to start in the morning, a man came over from the house and told Faye that he would pilot us through the rest of the water, that it was very dangerous in places where the road had been built up, and if a narrow route was not carefully followed, a team would go down a bank of 4 or 5 feet. He had with him just the skeleton of a wagon, the four wheels, with 2 or 3 long boards on top, drawn by 2 horses. So we went down in the dirty water again, that seemed to get deeper and deeper as we splashed on. Now and then I could catch a glimpse of our pilot standing up on the boards, very much like a circus rider, for the wagon wheels were twisting around over the roots of trees and stones in a way that required careful balancing on his part. We got along very well until about noon, when a soldier came splashing up on a mule and told Faye that one of the wagons had turned over. That was dreadful news, and made me most anxious about the trunks and chests, and the poor chickens, too, all of which might be down under the water. They got the ambulance under some trees, unfastened the mules and led them away, leaving me alone without even the driver. The soldier had thoughtfully led up Pete for Faye to ride back, and the mules were needed to assist in pulling the wagon up. Fortunately the wagon was caught by a tree and did not go entirely over, and it so happened, too, that it was the one loaded more with furniture than anything else, so not much damage was done. Our pilot had left us some time before, to hurry on and get any passengers that might come in the stage that runs daily between Helena and Bozeman. As soon as I began to look around a little after I was left alone in the ambulance, I discovered that not so very far ahead was an opening in the trees and bushes, and that a bit of beautiful dry land could be seen. I was looking at it with longing eyes, when suddenly something came down the bank and on into the water, and not being particularly brave, I thought of the unprotected position I was in. But the terrible monster turned out to be our pilot, and as he came nearer I saw that he had something on the wagon, whether men or women or mere bags of stuff I could not tell. But in time he got near enough for me to see that 2 men were with him, most miserable, scared tourists, both standing up on the seesawing boards, the first with arms around the pilot's neck, and the second with his arms around him. They were dressed very much alike, each one having on his head an immaculate white straw hat, and over his coat a long, very long linen duster, and they both had on gloves. Their trousers were pulled up as high as they could get them, giving a fine display of white hose and low shoes. The last one was having additional woe, for one leg of his trousers was slipping down, and of course it was impossible for him to pull it up and keep his balance. Every turn of the wheels the thick yellow water was being spattered on them, and I can imagine the condition they were in by the time they reached the little inn on the island. The pilot thought they were funny, too, for when he passed he grinned and jerked his head back to call my attention to them. He called to know what had happened to me, and I told him that I was a derelict, and he would ascertain the cause further on. After a while, it seemed hours to me, Faye and the wagons came up, and in time we got out of the awful mess and on dry land. It was the 4th of July, and we all wished for a gun or something that would make a loud noise wherewith we could celebrate, not so much the day as our rejoicing at getting out of the wilderness. The men were in deplorable condition, wet and tired, for no one had been able to sleep the night before because of the vicious mosquitoes and the stamping of the poor animals. So when Faye saw one of the drivers go to a spring for water, and was told that it was a large, fine spring, he decided to camp right there and rest before going further. But rest we could not, for the mosquitoes were there also, and almost as bad as they had been on the island, and the tents inside were covered with them as soon as they were pitched. If there is a person who thinks that a mosquito has no brain and is incapable of looking ahead, that person will soon learn his mistake if ever he comes to the Missouri River, Montana. The heat was fierce, too, and made it impossible for us to remain in the tents, so we were obliged, after all, to sit out under the trees until the air had cooled at night sufficiently to chill the mosquitoes. The chickens were let out at every camp, and each time, without fail, they flew up to their boxes on the wagons. Charlie would put in little temporary roosts that made them more comfortable, and before daylight every morning he would gather up the little ones and the mothers and put them in the crates for the day. He is willing and faithful, but has queer ideas about some things. Just as I was getting in the ambulance the second morning on the trip, I heard a crunching sound, and then another, and looking back I saw the Chinaman on top of the mess chest, with head bent over and elbows sticking out, jumping up and down with all his strength. I ran over and told him not to do so, for I saw at once what was the matter. But he said, "He very big, he no go downy, me fixie him," and up and down he went again, harder than ever. After a lengthy argument he got down, and I showed him once more how to put the things in so the top would shut tight. There were a good many pieces of broken china, and these Charlie pitched over in the water with a grin that plainly said, "You see, me fixie you." Of course the soldiers saw it all and laughed heartily, which made Charlie very angry, and gave him a fine opportunity to express himself in Chinese. The rest of the trip was pleasant, and some of the camps were delightful, but I am afraid that I no longer possess beautiful white chickens. My Chinaman seems to be the owner of all, big and small. End of letter. End of Section 11.